This morning I'd like to start by directing your attention to two distinct areas of thought that probably at first are going to seem completely unrelated, but we will make a connection between them, and that's going to be the basis of what we are looking at this morning. The first area of thought concerns military generals. And if you think back to whatever you might have learned in a history class a long time ago, who are the best military minds in history? I really think your average person would be hard-pressed to put together much of a list, but that's what we have the internet for. And that's what I largely consulted for this. And once I started hearing the names, it sort of, the fog left and started to come back to me. It jogged my memory a bit. Names like Napoleon and Hannibal and Alexander the Great and Julius Caesar, Genghis Khan, and even more recently, General George Patton. In the Bible, David was a great military leader, and he is described as a man of war. Now, we'll set military generals aside just for a moment here, and now think about traitors. People who betray others. For me, the very first person that came to mind was Benedict Arnold. And I was surprised how little I actually remembered about him until I did a little research. He was a military general under George Washington. But Benedict got upset because he was passed over for promotions and some other things happened that sort of hurt his pride, didn't make him feel too good about some things. So in 1780, he defected to the British during the American Revolution. The British, of course, were who the Americans were fighting against, and that gave him the label that he could never shake forever of traitor. To this day, Benedict Arnold's name is synonymous with being a traitor. Just a few years ago, being a sports fan as I am, I remember basketball player LeBron James left one team and went to another team. So his prior team had fans who were starting to call him Benedict James because, a play on Benedict Arnold. They just didn't like the way that they were treated whenever he changed teams. A pro athlete changing teams, not exactly on par with what Benedict Arnold actually did, but the idea is it brings to mind feelings of distrust about a certain individual. And actually it was Benjamin Franklin who compared Benedict Arnold to Judas Iscariot from the Bible. Judas, of course. But interestingly, Ben Franklin once wrote these words: Judas sold only one man, Arnold 3 million. It's an interesting way to look at it. In the passage this morning, we're going to encounter and talk about a man named Ahithophel. And again, when we're going through this, the names, it's just fascinating to me how some of the names have lived on, like there's many Davids. We have Davids here this morning. Not many Ahithophels out there you're going to come in contact with in your life. But trying to get past the difficulty in the names, Ahithophel could be described as both a great military general in the mind of Alexander the Great and those kind, but also a traitor, and maybe more so than Benedict Arnold, and we'll see that as we get into this. I don't think it is an exaggeration at all to call Ahithophel the Judas of the Old Testament, hence the message title this morning, and we'll see why. We'll get into it by reading in the Bible this morning. If you are following in your Pew Bible, you'll find that it begins on page 227, I believe, and just go to 2 Samuel 17, and I want to just read the one preceding verse. That's chapter 16, verse 23. Then we'll go up to 14. Then I just want to skip some things that aren't don't really apply much to what we're talking, and then just get one concluding verse later. So it's not as complicated as it seems, but we'll start in 2 Samuel 16, verse 23. We'll read up to verse 14 then for now. Now in those days the advice Ahithophel gave was like that of one who inquires of God. That was how both David and Absalom regarded all of Ahithophel's advice. Ahithophel said to Absalom, "I would choose 12,000 men and set out tonight in pursuit of David. I would attack him while he is weary and weak. I would strike him with terror, and then all the people with him will flee. I would strike down only the king and bring all the people back to you. The death of the man you seek will mean the return of all. All the people will be unharmed." This plan seemed good to Absalom and to all the elders of Israel. But Absalom said, "Summon also Hushai the Archite, so we can hear what he has to say." When Hushai came to him, Absalom said, "Ahithophel has given this advice. Should we do what he says? If not, give us your opinion." Hushai, which I will add here, a friend of David, by the way, so that makes a big difference here. He replied to Absalom, "The advice Ahithophel has given is not good this time. You should know your father and his men. They are fighters, and as fierce as a wild bear robbed of her cubs. Besides, your father is an experienced fighter. He will not spend the night with the troops. Even now he is hidden in a cave or some other place. If he should attack your troops first, whoever hears about it will say there has been a slaughter among the troops who follow Absalom. Then even the bravest soldier, whose heart is like the heart of a lion, will melt with fear. For all Israel knows that your father is a fighter, and that those with him are brave. So I advise you, let all Israel, from Dan to Beersheba, as numerous as the sand of the seashore, be gathered to you, with you yourself leading them into battle. Then we will attack him wherever he may be found, and we will fall on him as dew settles on the ground. Neither he nor any of his men will be left alive. If he withdraws into a city, then all Israel will bring ropes to that city, and we will drag it down to the valley until not even a piece of it can be found." Absalom and all the men of Israel said, "The advice of Hushai the Archite is better than that of Ahithophel." For the Lord had determined to frustrate the good advice of Ahithophel in order to bring disaster on Absalom. So this is the part we're just going to skip down a few verses and just conclude it with verse 23. When Ahithophel saw that his advice had not been followed, he saddled his donkey and set out for his house in his hometown. He put his house in order and then hanged himself. So he died and was buried in his father's tomb. May the Lord's blessing be added to the reading and the hearing of his holy word. Now, this part of the life of David takes up several chapters, but it's necessary to take a look at these to illustrate the sovereign authority that God has over the situation and the authority that God has over the world in general. What happened is that in chapter 15, David flees Jerusalem in disgrace, and many of his people stopped supporting him, but there were a few honorable people who still remained, who still gave him support, and they were committed to him as their king. And among those was a man named Hushai. David sends this man on a covert mission to thwart the plans of his son Absalom by giving him bad advice, or at least some advice that can help David buy a little time and levy a better defense if there comes to be some kind of a battle. In chapter 16, Hushai appears to Absalom and he pledges his allegiance to him, so he gains his favor, the favor of this competing regime. Now that sets the stage for chapter 17, which we read the beginning of there. This guy who is pretty much General Patton and Benedict Arnold all rolled into one, named Ahithophel, the Judas of the Old Testament. In that last verse of chapter 16 that I wanted to read to set the stage, it says, "Now in those days Ahithophel, the advice Ahithophel gave was like that of one who inquires of God." So in other words, when this guy spoke up, people listened to him. They knew, as far as military actions were concerned, he knew what he was talking about. He was so wise that people thought, this guy must be in tune with God because he knows so much. And Sadly, as is often the case, appearances can be deceiving. That was not so with Ahithophel. This sets the stage now for this scene that is really nothing short of miraculous. When you go through the Bible, and people will go through and they'll mark down all the miracles that have happened and see how they occurred and all that, this isn't going to come up in any of those lists because it's not really a natural miracle like the sun standing still or anything like that. But still, when you really get into it, we'll see how miraculous this was. So Absalom, who is trying to overthrow David, he gets military advice from Ahithophel, who tells him, attack him quickly. He said, and do it directly, because he's on the run. He doesn't have time to set up a proper defense. And the text leads us to believe that this probably would have been successful if Absalom were to take his advice. However, Absalom knew that Hushai was an advisor to David. So he asked for his take, thinking maybe I can get some kind of a inside information on what David was thinking, and maybe I can attack it in a different way. So first of all, the fact that Absalom even asked for a second opinion after getting Ahithophel's great military advice is mind-boggling in and of itself. The best way I can explain this is that football season is finally here. And so sort of a football analogy, if you think back to the good old days before politics entered into football, you might remember Vince Lombardi, the great coach of the Green Bay Packers. So if I were, say, maybe a college coach or a high school coach, and if I needed advice on a certain part of the game, if I could call up anyone on the phone, I'd probably call up Vince Lombardi because he's the best of the best. He's been there, he's done that. And once Vince Lombardi gives you advice, there's no need to ask anyone else. You already asked the best, right? So instead of taking Vince Lombardi's advice, it's like someone then picking up the phone and asking my mom what play she would run in a certain situation of the game. Now, don't get me wrong, my mom understands football. She knows what's going on, but she's not reading defenses and stuff like that. She's not a Vince Lombardi, okay? So sort of, that's pretty much what we're looking at here. When Absalom sought the advice from Hushai, rather after hearing already from Ahithophel. So that's why I say this was so miraculous. It was miraculous because he sought a second opinion, and what's even more miraculous, so you got someone else's opinion, doesn't hurt, I guess, but more miraculous is he takes the second opinion, and he does what Hushai tells him to do, and that would prove to be a terrible mistake. Look what Hushai says. He says, let all Israel be gathered to you. Now, look into his words. Look at what he's trying to do. He says, with you yourself leading them into battle. He's appealing to his sense of vanity. He's saying, everybody knows you're a good-looking guy. They say David was a handsome man, and his son Absalom was also a handsome man. This is your big moment to shine in front of all of Israel. You don't do this in secret. Don't go at night when they're on the run. Take your time. Get people together. You lead them in. You can be the big guy who's going to lead your country to victory. So he appeals to a sense of self-centeredness. And it worked out, actually. He ignored the wise advice of the best military mind around. And that's what vanity can do for a person, or against a person, really. You make bad decisions because your focus has now shifted to exalting yourself rather than accomplishing the goal at hand. Another point that we shouldn't ignore is that last week we read that David prayed that Ahithophel's advice would not be heeded. And what did we see happen? This is how that went about happening, and in a rather miraculous way, as I just described. You see, this is now the spiritual battle behind the scenes that's taking place, and we don't see any of this happening, actually. David's humble prayer was so much stronger than the decision of a vain enemy. And that's how it usually is. This is exactly why we can't ever be lax in our prayer life either. We don't know what God is working behind the scenes. And when we go to him in prayer, it focuses our mind too. It takes our mind off of this situation, focuses it on God, the only one who can really do anything about it when you come to think of it. David realized the situation's out of his hands now, so he put all of his faith in God to bring about a proper result. And when we pray, we are proving to God that we are trusting him and that our will is aligned with his will. Moving on to our second point now, when you read this section of the Bible, you may want to ask yourself, why did Ahithophel do what he did? Why did he defect to Absalom? And why ultimately did he betray David? I wish I could point to a specific verse in the Bible that gives us that answer, but it doesn't exist. It doesn't tell us exactly why. But even so, I don't think we're completely in the dark either about what could have led to his decision. All we have to do is take what we know and extrapolate from that and see if it makes sense. Again, in this series, we're only reading certain parts. If you read everything, a little more would come into view and make sense. But something interesting that the Bible does tell us is that Ahithophel had a granddaughter. And I find it especially interesting that even though the Bible doesn't always tell us the names of certain women, it does in this case, and I think that's for a good reason. Ahithophel's granddaughter was a woman named Bathsheba. Yeah, so the Bible doesn't inform us of this detail until 6 chapters after that episode takes place. But if you want to check it out later for yourself, if you jot down 2 Samuel 11:3, that tells us that Bathsheba was the daughter of a man named Eliam. And 2 Samuel 23:34, see, these aren't, you got to really put things together. They're not all together. 2 Samuel 23:34 tells us Eliam's father was Ahithophel. Therefore, she's his granddaughter. So, okay, so they're related, big deal. What does that have to do with anything? Well, first of all, it explains why Bathsheba was bathing so close to the king's palace when David spied her several chapters ago, because her father and her husband and her grandfather all in David's inner circle. Okay, so they certainly lived close by, and that explains a little more why it was so easy for David to pursue her in the way that he did. Secondly, we can only speculate now at this point, but what I told you up to this point are facts. But I can tell you, if I had a granddaughter and if she were pursued by a man named David, and if he got her pregnant, and if he was responsible for the death of her husband, and if he were responsible for the death of her baby, which was my great-grandchild, how do you suppose I would feel towards David? Not very good. I can tell you what I'd want to do if I weren't a Christian. That's one thing. I would basically want him to pay for what he had done. And if I were as highly regarded as Ahithophel was, maybe I'd start to think in my mind, maybe I can pull some strings and get this guy after all. So maybe he held a grudge against David. Maybe he didn't forgive him for what he did. And maybe he was certainly determined to make him pay. So if we are on to something here in this pattern of thinking, then things might start to make a little more sense. Get inside his head a little bit. When Absalom goes and rejects his advice, which he knows is perfectly good advice, by the way, probably, maybe, the first time in his life that Ahithophel's advice wasn't followed. So imagine how that hurts his pride, too. He feels rejected now. Also, he knows that when Absalom took Hushai's advice, it was terrible advice he was taking. He knew it was over. So there's no way that he's going to defeat David by doing this. So it's terrible advice because the time to attack was when David was on the run and when he's weak and unable to defend himself properly. As far as Ahithophel was concerned, the only thing left to do was get your house in order and then end it, sadly, which is what he did. Because he knows the legal punishment for betrayal, for traitors like Benedict Arnold, is a death sentence. And that's what he did. He wasn't going to put himself and his family through all of that because he knew the proverbial handwriting was on the wall. So he basically just did the deed himself. And that leads to our final point. And this is a look more so as to how this man is similar to Judas Iscariot. Similarities are many when you get down to it, but I'll just share a few of them with you. Both of them were highly trusted by their peers. We know that Judas was so trusted that he was the treasurer, that he had the money bag. Ahithophel's advice was accepted by everyone in Israel except for the one man that it really mattered, and that was Absalom. Another thing is that both of these men thought that they were following the wrong kind of king. Ahithophel was certainly upset at David's sin and how that personally affected his family and how that was made public. So he probably wanted a better king than David. He thought David is not the right guy to lead Israel because of all these reasons. And we know Judas was along with everybody else and that they wanted Jesus to be the military king, that the Bible prophesies he will be one day. It just wasn't the right time for that. In the end, I think they both wanted a king that was going to benefit them in the short term and is a response of their selfishness. Furthermore, both Ahithophel and Judas refused God's grace. This is a big one here. There's no evidence that either of them repented and accepted God's grace for what they had done. And that leads to one more similarity, is that they both died in the same way. They both hanged themselves. Ahithophel did it because he knew his treason, probably because he knew his treason would be exposed. And Judas hanged himself because his treason had already been exposed to some people. They were both really cut out of the same cloth, as they say. I could go further with more similarities between the two, but it would only serve to confirm what we've already talked about, is that Ahithophel and Judas and people like them in the world seek to serve themselves first before anything else. The real shame is that in both of these cases, God set them up to be in positions where they could thrive, and they could have done great work for God. They could have done amazingly good things, but most of them chose, as I like to say, be like Frank Sinatra and do it my way. What's even more interesting is both Ahithophel and Judas spent a lot of time with Christians. In the Old Testament, they were basically Christians, just a matter of semantics there. Yet, despite all those influences, it did not impact their lives in any significant way. That relationship didn't make them change their lives for the better. Instead of following God, they sought to undermine God. And it means that we are not responsible if others reject Christ. All we can do is be the best positive influence that we can be every day. And every day wake up, get out of bed, live our lives with faith. And just look at Judas. He hung out with Jesus probably every day for 3 years. And the goodness of Jesus wasn't good enough to convert Jesus. So I guess we shouldn't take it personally when those close to us reject the faith. So who knows what individual in your life could be like Judas or Ahithophel. I've heard many stories about people going to church for years and years before the light bulb finally goes off in their head and they finally see themselves as a sinner that they are and realize all of a sudden, yeah, Jesus paid that sin debt for me and I can't be good enough on my own to satisfy God. In a moment, that person goes from traitor to disciple. And there's no third option in there. It's a one or the other. It's a black or white kind of situation. If you don't have saving faith in Jesus Christ, then as far as God is concerned, you are a traitor to him, because he created us to worship him. And anyone who refuses to do that betrays their own creator and their own father. Accepting Jesus into our life now, that does many things. It acknowledges, as I said, we are not perfect in the eyes of God. It proves to us, to God, that we know who God really is, since he loved us and sent his son for us, so that if we would accept him, we could be saved and avoid the punishment that we deserve. And it acknowledges that we once rejected him, but now we've changed, and we are now living for him, eager to do all these things that he plans for us to do. So I just want to close it out shortly here, leave you with a little perspective on God's sovereignty. Notice in the section that we read, David is not a major player in here. Although the chapter is so key in his life, this is a crucial time for David, and he's hardly mentioned. That's because God's frame of reference is so much larger than any of us. David simply uttered a prayer earlier that we didn't even mention today. And then we read about how to influence all these other people and how they started doing things that affected David's life. That's the power of prayer. If you're here today dealing with some issue that you just don't know what to do about it, first, always go to the Lord in prayer. Pray about it, not God do this for me, but pray about it in the will of God. That's what David did, and we see what happened. If we don't do that, we shouldn't expect anything to happen because of our prayer, because we're not aligned with God. But once we pray, don't just pray and get on with your day. Listen quietly. See if God, maybe he'll give you some instructions to do. Or maybe he's just going to grow your faith by just waiting a little bit and see how invested are you in this prayer. While you're waiting, consider and continue the other work that God already has laid on your heart to do. Life doesn't have a pause button. We wish it did oftentimes. So we need to keep doing that good work in the meantime and let God do his work while we do our work. And no sense in sitting around worrying either about what we prayed about, because the Bible tells us you can't add 1 cubit to your life, or 1 hour to the length of your life by worrying. It's in God's hands at that point. This is what David learned in time as he matured in the faith, and it's an important lesson for all Christians to understand. And for those who maybe you're not dealing with such an urgent spiritual issue right now, thank God for that if that's the case. But we still need to be obedient to God in the meantime, because we don't know. Maybe he's working out a situation for someone else and using us to accomplish that goal. That's what Hushai did when he was obedient to David, and his obedience changed the course of many lives. So no matter if you realize it or not, there's a good chance right now your life is influencing someone else's, and maybe it's even someone else that you'll never come in contact with your life. It's like this. Since God is sovereign, his plan will work out in the end. The Bible tells us it will. So if I were you, I would much rather be a part of God's plan and his solution like Hushai, rather than like Absalom and Ahithophel, who were acting against God's plan and were working in vain. Let's now close out with a word of prayer.